Hello, everyone. My name is Kamel, and thank you so much for coming to my talk, Keeping Up with Modern Automotive Exploitation, presented at RootCon 15 in 2021. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the more modern exploits that have been publicized on vehicles in the last few years and kind of get a better understanding of how vehicles are being targeted in the cybersecurity space in the modern day. So, quick introduction to myself. I'm an automotive cybersecurity architect at White Motion. White Motion is a lesser known company that's actually a subsidiary of Marelli. Marelli is a global automotive supplier that's originally based in Italy, but a few years back, they actually merged with a Japanese supplier called Calsonic Kansei. Rather boring story, but long story short, now they're one entity called Marelli, and I work for a automotive cybersecurity focused subsidiary wholly owned by that corporation. As a result, I'm actually calling in from Tokyo today. So, konnichiwa, hajimemashite. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a trilingual car hacking enthusiast. As my short demo just showed, I am decently fluent in Japanese. I wouldn't say I'm great at it, but I also speak English and Arabic. I'm an ex-admin of the Automotive Security Research Group branch in Detroit, Michigan, where I'm originally from. And I am the founder of the ASRG branch in Japan. Unfortunately, since moving here, the pandemic has kind of shut things down. So we haven't had a lot of opportunities to have a very, how should I say, exciting ASRG experience yet. But in the future, we're sure to have a lot of cool things to look out for. So if you're interested in ASRG, hit me up and I'll put you in touch. So when it comes to automotive, I have a couple of areas of interest. I enjoy doing Bluetooth research, research into the USB protocol, RF, and some digital forensics. And outside of the laboratory, I like to play fighting games. I love cooking, and I'm a very poor ukulele player. I haven't actually practiced in a long time, so unfortunately, I won't be able to provide any solos for anyone anytime soon. So a quick look at the objectives of this talk. I want to make this talk to kind of bring anyone who may not be following the automotive security industry so closely into kind of a similar, common frame of reference, right? So I want to talk about automotive cybersecurity in 2021. And for those of you who don't know anything at all about automotive cybersecurity, maybe this is the first time you've ever considered a car being hacked. Don't worry, I've got a very brief intro for you as well. So you'll be able to join us for the rest of the talk. After that kind of intro and catching up to the modern state of automotive cybersecurity in 2021, I want to go over a couple of significant disclosures that have happened in the last few years, namely the the Lexus Bluetooth hack of 2020, the Tesla Bluetooth hack of 2020, the Tesla drone hack earlier this year in 2021. And then I want to kind of look at what these different vulnerability or exploitation publications have in common and how they all kind of work into this view of the vehicle as a modern security target. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how it ties into IoT security, and then about product vulnerability management in the automotive industry and why these specific cases highlight its importance going forward into the connected transportation future. So, automotive security in 2021, right? Thanks to Chris and Charlie, Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek, two of the most famous car hackers of all time, automotive cybersecurity has very steadily become a rising concern for both governments and industry all over the world. In 2015, they were actually able to display or kind of demonstrate that a Jeep Cherokee was able to be hacked from kilometers away without the hackers ever having come into physical contact with the vehicle. Of course, this was done over a very long period of time. I think it took them about 2 years total of research and reverse engineering of the system. But the end result was they were able to identify a vehicle through its VIN number and connect to it over the internet through the mobile carrier in use in the vehicle. The network that they were using over their cellular modems was able to be used to log into these vehicles, and a lack of security checks on firmware flashing, I'm simplifying things a little bit to get through with this, but allowed them to reflash firmware on some controllers in the vehicle and take control. This allowed them to kill the brakes of the car, and there's a very cool video of a poor journalist experiencing this firsthand out there on the internet. I encourage all of you to watch. But thanks to their efforts, this industry has become much more widely understood, and there's a lot more interest and conversation about automotive security. But 6-7 years later, it's still kind of the poster child for automotive cybersecurity research. And because it's the holy grail, it's long range remote takeover of a vehicle to some extent, right? So it's the most archetypal example you could give of a car hack in the worst case scenario. But that's not what today is about. Today is about making sure everyone is aware of some of the more recent hacks that have happened on cars, right? But anyway, so when it comes to vehicles, of course, it's not just about information security and privacy as much as traditional IT security is, right? If you think about my phone getting hacked, or maybe my laptop, even worst case scenario, my company's network, assuming these aren't connected to any heavy duty industrial machinery or anything else that may cause someone physical harm, the most realistic impact of a hack like this is generally considered to be loss of wealth. It's kind of like financial damage, right? For at least for the average person. When it comes to vehicles, it's a little bit different. We're talking about a very large torpedo that kind of cruises along the street at 60, 70 miles an hour, or about 100 kilometers an hour. And if this this large 2-ton hunk of steel carrying people inside it is ever compromised or interfered with in a way such that an accident is more likely or intentionally caused, you have a situation where public safety is now a concern for automotive cybersecurity. So the stakes are a little bit higher, and that has actually gotten the attention of governments and standardization bodies all over the world. So among these, you have the United Nations, and you have the Society of Automotive Engineers, and the International Standards Association. These bodies, of course, the United Nations, I'm sure you've heard of them before, they provide guidance to different nations and come up with regulations and mostly non-binding legislation to help countries more or less operate properly. And this applies as well to technology. So the ECE WP29 is a document that was actually published by the United Nations in 2020, detailing some of their recommendations for cybersecurity best practices, and essentially encouraging countries to write into their own laws that mandate automotive manufacturers to undergo cybersecurity tests for their vehicles and make sure that these vehicles are cyber secure to the extent possible before they're allowed to be released onto the street. Similarly, the ISO SAE 21434 standard was actually released, or I guess finalized, very recently. The draft has been in the works for several years now, but this document is more of a technical guide that serves as a complementary document to the United Nations regulation, in which experts from the industry have come together and provided a list of best practices for how to actually perform these cybersecurity tests and checks for vehicles to ensure that they're as secure as possible before being released into the market. These are, of course, very lengthy documents and could probably take up their own talk, but just the fact that they exist is evidence that governments and standardizing bodies alike are putting a high priority on automotive cybersecurity for the future of connected transportation. And then, of course, one last thing a couple last things to mention is that because the industry is still relatively new and not that mainstream, especially when it comes to cybersecurity as a kind of a much broader field of study, there's a severe lack of professionals. And so if you've ever been thinking, man, I wish I had a job that I had a little bit more of a niche in, right? If you're an IT or traditional cybersecurity engineer and you're thinking of specializing in a field where you could really stand out, I highly recommend you check out Automotive. There's a lot of fun in car hacking, and there are a lot of great resources to help you get started if you're interested, but leave that for later. And then finally, the massive supply chain. This is something you can't really escape when it comes to talking about automotive security, right? When you consider, for any of you familiar with the automotive industry, just how many different companies have a hand in deciding what goes into a vehicle, the prospect of making sure that all of these companies based in different countries with different laws, different regulations, different standards of practice, different budgets or even safety protocols coming together, it's very daunting, right? Because you have the OEM who at the end of the day sells the car, puts their logo, their stamp on it, and they're the brand that you know, right? Most people in the world would know a brand like Ford or Tesla. But then you have the tier ones who provide a lot of the modules to these OEMs, right? You might know some of the bigger companies if you've ever been exposed to the industry, right? Continental, Denso, etc. But your average everyday person doesn't know that these companies exist, right? So they may not have the awareness of how daunting of a task it is to really propagate cybersecurity best practices throughout such a huge supply chain. And then, of course, it goes farther down into tier two suppliers, so on and so forth. But that being said, these OEMs and tier ones, the entire automotive industry, they're still doing their best to incorporate cybersecurity into their development processes, right? The automotive industry is not a very fast moving, young type of industry. It's pretty well established. Cars have been around for a long time. The automakers have gotten pretty good at doing what they do. And so they've kind of settled into their ways, for better or for worse, right? They have a process, they have a system, and it takes time to add changes to this system, right? It's a very mature industry. You can't just introduce something like a cybersecurity regulation or a bunch of standards and expect them to be applied to the whole industry overnight. It's just not realistic. So this fact of the matter is that, well, okay, now the United Nations has put out this regulation. A lot of the governments around the world are starting to pick it up. The OEMs and the manufacturers and suppliers within the countries that are applying this, this new legal structure, they're doing their best to catch up and try and incorporate these into their processes for development. But it is taking time, and it's still definitely going to be a trial and error as we go into the future of actual usage and implementation of these standards. But there's a lot of industry groups encouraging collaboration that I want to kind of mention. I mentioned the Automotive Security Research Group briefly before in my own introduction. ASRG is a group that promotes open access to information about the automotive cybersecurity industry. We have branches all over the world. It's completely free to join. I'm not doing any sponsorship-based plugging here, but I highly recommend you check out ASRG if you're a hobbyist who's interested in learning about car hacking and just kind of getting into the industry through direct contact with professionals. ASRG is great for that. On the more, how should I say, corporate business side of things, you have the Auto ISAC and J Auto ISAC. So the ISAC is, of course, an information sharing community based around the OEMs and tier ones, the actual players of the industry who make the vehicles that actually go onto the road. They have this community which they're able to share information about vulnerabilities, etc., with one another, updated vulnerability information, training, setting standards and regulations. They have some ties to the government that allows them to kind of be on top of different regulations and legislation before it actually hits the books per se, which makes it very convenient for people working in the industry. But those are not quite as accessible for outsiders, right? In the sense that you don't already work at one of these companies. And then the J Auto ISAC is just the Japanese version of the Auto ISAC. So following the same model, but mainly attended to by Japanese companies. So I'm done with the boring stuff. We can actually get into some case studies now. But before we get started, I want to make a quick disclaimer. While I'm not directly related to these pieces of research, I'm a huge fan of the work. I always try to give as much credit to the original researchers as possible. But I believe that there's a lot of value in being able to share this information and the fact that this research is going on with a broader audience. Of course, I do my own automotive research as well, but because my employer is usually the sponsor for said research, I have the NDA problem prevents me from talking about my own work most of the time, especially in Japan. They're very touchy about confidentiality when it comes to cybersecurity work. So please forgive me if it feels like I'm just a content vulture, as it were. But we're going to talk about one of my favorite ones from the recent future, the Lexus Bluetooth hack of March 2020. So this hack, it affected several Lexus brand vehicles that were manufactured outside of Japan between 2016 and I believe 2019. This particular disclosure kicked up quite a bit of a storm in the Japanese community especially because Toyota is seen as the big dog in the Japanese automotive industry, right? So if anything happens to Toyota, all the other smaller OEMs are kind of, pay very close attention. Like, what happened? Like, is it okay? Like, do we have the same problems? Do we have to worry about this, right? So this one was actually very, very prominent when it came out here in the Japanese industry. So Keen Labs, I believe they're owned by Tencent in China. They showed that through a vulnerability in the vehicle's Bluetooth stack, they were able to execute commands without having to be paired with the vehicle. Essentially remote code execution through Bluetooth, but they didn't actually reveal what vulnerabilities led to this RCE in their initial paper. Some vulnerability reporting websites reported it as Blueborn. For those of you who may not be familiar with Blueborn, it's a very high-profile suite of remote code execution vulnerabilities that was released by Armis Labs in, I believe, 2017. So that kind of lines up with the timeline. It's very possible that this was the vulnerability that Keen Labs was able to exploit in these vehicles, seeing as the start date for manufacture of vehicles with this particular head unit or infotainment system in them were initially created starting in 2016. So, but I don't know if there's an official, I guess, identification for the specific vulnerability they use, but it should be maybe more information online, as they didn't want to reveal too much information at the initial disclosure of this research, of course, for security purposes and to keep things confidential. But anyway, because Bluetooth was being run with root user privileges, the researchers were able to send instructions to construct a Wi-Fi based backdoor that would automatically grant them a root shell. Right? They were essentially able to install a backdoor into the vehicle's infotainment system over Bluetooth, but thanks to the fact that they were able to pivot to the Wi-Fi protocol instead, they were actually able to enhance the range at which this technique was usable. So while Wi-Fi itself wasn't exactly, the target of attack initially, they were able to use the Wi-Fi network as a pivoting tool to expand access to their attack target, right? Because obviously Wi-Fi has a slightly longer range than Bluetooth. They're both considered pretty short-range communication technologies, but Wi-Fi definitely has its benefits when compared to Bluetooth. But so they chose to, instead of continuing on the Bluetooth remote code execution, go for the root shell option over Wi-Fi instead. And so from here, the researchers were able to abuse the Linux board's administrative position within the in-vehicle infotainment system to reflash the firmware on a secondary ECU. Now, there's one device, the in-vehicle infotainment system, inside this car, but it has multiple boards inside it, multiple different PCBs, each of which have a couple of computers inside. And they have different privileges and different roles that they play inside this device, right? The IVI is the infotainment unit. It's usually what you would see like a little screen on inside the vehicle. You can connect your phone over Bluetooth or set up a Wi-Fi hotspot. The modern vehicles have all sorts of cool gadgets built into their IVIs these days. Some of them even have games, I think. You can download apps from app stores. But the point is, among these different boards inside the IVI, one of them was technically the administrative board, and that's the board they were able to get that remote code execution on. So because of this board's privilege in the IVI's environment, it actually was in the position where it's allowed to push updates to the other computers inside the IVI, right? So this board was kind of the boss of the IVI system. And from there, they were able to reflash other processors and take advantage of this unit they've actually compromised, right? This is an issue where there's a lack of checking and making sure that any firmware updates being sent to different parts of the vehicle are properly signed using signatures that can be verified, cryptographic signatures, to ensure that unauthorized firmware isn't being written to your devices inside your car. So the secondary ECU that they targeted was responsible for the interaction with the vehicle's CAN buses. For those of you with no car hacking experience, CAN bus is controller area network. It's a in-vehicle network for all intents and purposes, one of the most common ones in the whole world. Essentially, these are specific networks that are designed to allow different controllers inside a vehicle to communicate with one another over short distances. But the CAN device they had compromised and reflashed originally had some filters on it, right? They were not allowed to send arbitrary CAN messages. It was kind of restricted to a certain subset of functionality specific to that operational environment for the usual operation of the vehicle. But remember, they have the ability to change the software. So they were actually able to disable those CAN filters and unlock arbitrary CAN bus message access through their foothold on that authoritative board in the IVI. So of course, once again, this comes back to the lack of firmware signature checking on the secondary board. And had such a measure been in place, even with the remote code execution on the main Linux board, there may have been, no opportunity for the researchers to pivot to the in-vehicle network, which gives them access to a much broader range of controllers inside the vehicle. Of course, separation of your networks and sandboxing, of course, all come into play here. Those are all security principles that are very relevant in automotive too, right? So following this rewriting of the vehicle's firmware, the researchers were able to send arbitrary CAN data, including diagnostic requests. This, in theory, could lead to even further exploitation of the vehicle, as through diagnostics, you can actually reprogram other controllers in the car. They would, of course, have to reverse engineer the diagnostic protocol used to flash these vehicles. The diagnostic protocols also use something called a security access mechanism when it comes to programming as well. And so this may have taken more time, but it essentially is just showing that there is an open-ended door for further post-exploitation activities on this target. But, of course, that rabbit hole is an entirely different conversation, and it's mostly theoretical. But the full technical details are probably going to be a lot more interesting for those of you who want to read. Tencent did release a blog post detailing in much more detail how they did all of these brilliant, all this brilliant research, right? So the next case study is on some research that was performed on Tesla vehicles. And this was actually disclosed also in 2020, but more closer to the end of the year. This one was actually done by a gentleman named Leonard Wouters. I believe he gave a talk about this exact piece of research in the 2021 DEF CON Car Hacking Village. So if you want to hear him talk about this, I highly recommend you go and listen to him. He'll have some more details that I wouldn't be able to share with you. But the gentleman who did this, of course, I'm so sorry for my poor pronunciation if I pronounce his name wrong, but Leonard Wouters from Belgium, he showed that the Bluetooth-based firmware update process used in Tesla Model X key fobs could be abused to eventually lead to theft of the vehicle, right? Teslas are generally seen as the most, high-tech, state-of-the-art vehicles in the world right now, right? A lot of people have this impression that the Tesla is the car of tomorrow, right? It is the all the bells and whistles possible on a vehicle. And to some extent, that's very true. But that also means it's kind of a sneak peek into what the security landscape for a vehicle is going to look like. So when something happens to Tesla, you better pay attention. Excuse me. Wouters found that the Model X key fob responds to a signal emitted by the vehicle's BCM, which can then lead to a reprogramming session done by Bluetooth, right? So Bluetooth traditionally in vehicles has been used for things like media control, hands-free phone calls, sharing your contacts with your vehicle. There hasn't really been a lot of cases of Bluetooth being used for anything remotely safety critical. And in this case, we're seeing that Tesla has decided to take this Bluetooth technology and use it for something a little bit more important, right? They're using it as the actual conduit by which they push software updates or firmware updates to their key fobs, right? It's kind of a big deal, right? You're changing the software on the key to your car over Bluetooth. And Bluetooth research is something I may have mentioned before. I have a passing interest in. There's a lot of really great Bluetooth research coming out in the last few years, but I don't want to go too far into that. But the point is, right, this kind of novel application of Bluetooth in automotive is what led to this attack being discovered. So the only authentication needed from the BCM was derived from the vehicle's VIN, the vehicle identification number. The vehicle identification number isn't usually considered secret information. You can actually get this information from any car you see by just kind of peeking through the windshield. Right? If you take a look through the top, it's usually kind of written along the side on the top of the dashboard. So it's not considered highly confidential information by any stretch of the imagination. So since there was no code signing checks done on the firmware updates pushed to the key fob, rewriting the firmware to share an unlock code with the attacker's device was actually pretty easy. Once this was done, a disassembled Model X key fob could then be used to transmit the said signal to unlock the vehicle. So essentially, what Leonard and his team did, they actually got a Tesla BCM, off of eBay or something, and messed around with it, reprogrammed it, and used it to request an unlock signal from a key fob. So basically, they tricked the BCM into thinking it belonged to the car that the target key fob belonged to, so that they could then request for credentials to open the vehicle and get inside. But, at the end of the day, this particular vulnerability only granted them access to the inside of the vehicle. From here, now you have physical access to the vehicle. You have a rather broad attack surface now, right? You can actually plug into the in-vehicle networks now because of course these are physical networks. So you have access to much more targets for post-exploitation and pivoting. So through a port located under the Model X display, more damage can be done through the CAN bus, right? CAN bus coming back again once more from the last case study we went through. So CAN bus access to the BCM meant that they were able to use a different vulnerability to actually pair the BCM, the body control module that was inside the car, to their new fake Tesla key, right? That third Tesla key, the third-party Tesla key that they used to actually send the unlock signal, is now being reintroduced to this car, saying like, "Hey, look, I'm your new key. You should recognize me and let me start the car." And this is actually exactly what they did. So they tricked the car into thinking that the new key fob is the original key fob, or something along those lines, and were able to unlock all driving functionality for the car, essentially allowing them to steal it. Interestingly, all of this, the whole process only takes about, I'd say about 15 minutes, and everything that you needed to be able to perform this attack would cost you under $400, right? You could actually all fit it inside a lunchbox sized, backpack. Really, you could put it inside a backpack, sneak up behind a family who parked their Tesla and maybe went for a walk or go get some ice cream. All you needed to do is just follow them until you get that unlock signal, and then go back to the car and do everything else manually. And well, congratulations, you are now the new owner of a stolen Tesla Model X, right? So it's a very practical attack from the perspective of a motivation perspective, right? Because when it comes to cybersecurity, a lot of the reason that car hacks aren't very widespread yet is because the motivation to effort ratio is very low, right? There's not a lot of criminal benefit. Criminals aren't that interested in killing random people and causing havoc on the road. They're more interested in stealing things. They want actual financial return for their efforts. And that's why ransomware has become so prevalent over the last few years. But this is actually a scenario where you're using a very high-tech method to be able to steal a car. Now, whether or not this was ever used in such a malicious manner is something only God knows. But the fact that this exists is very concerning. So, but interestingly enough, the Model X key fobs do actually contain unique cryptographic certificates that should have prevented this reprogramming of the BCM to accept the new key as its key. However, the BCM never actually implements this certificate check. So The certificate is there, but the BCM is just not checking it. It's like they had everything in place to be able to avoid the same mistake that the Lexus fellows we talked about a second ago made. Unfortunately, they did miss the last step. And well, that's why we're talking about them today. So, but at this stage, the attacker now has the Model X and can drive away with it. And, you know, whoever comes back is going to be very sad to see that their car has disappeared without a trace. So hopefully this case study illustrates the importance of assuring that every layer of system security is properly configured. While the Bluetooth implementation itself wasn't faulty this time per se, as it was in the last one, right? In the last example we gave, the actual Bluetooth stack itself had a vulnerability resulting in remote code execution. In this example, the Bluetooth stack itself, more or less just fine. They were able to, they didn't actually, how should I say, compromise the vehicle through the Bluetooth stack itself. They used the processes on either end of the Bluetooth stack to actually make that happen, right? Excuse me. And then once again, of course, code signing and making sure that you have certificates ensuring that any firmware being pushed to any part of your vehicle is from the OEM or another approved source is rather important. So the last, where'd my car go? I could have sworn I had a car on the slide a second ago, but the last case study we're going to be looking at today is the Tesla drone hack, or cutely dubbed Tbone, that was revealed earlier in 2021, this year. So this hack was done by some fellows named Ralph Philip Weinman and Benedict Schumotzel. If I said that wrong, I'm very sorry. Of course, once again, my pronunciation might be off, but these guys did a great bit of research here and showed that Bluetooth isn't the only potentially vulnerable network in a vehicle today. There's a lot more that can be looked at. So this hack took advantage of a library with a vulnerability that was accessible over Wi-Fi as opposed to Bluetooth. Normally, Wi-Fi wouldn't be accessible to someone that's not connected to that access point in this, on the same subnet, more or less, as the actual vehicle itself. So it's a little bit harder to make use of this kind of vulnerability, on a car you've just encountered. But Teslas have this very weird quirk about them, at least in Europe, where all Teslas will automatically connect to a default service SSID, for any of you who've done Wi-Fi testing before. And this SSID is called Tesla service, wouldn't you know? They were actually able to find out the password in use for this SSID as well. And through that, they were able to successfully create a fake access point that this Tesla vehicle would then connect to. Now, that alone isn't really, the end of the world, right? Okay, you got the car to connect to your fake access point, that's awesome. But what did they do next? So the vulnerable software in question is called Conman. As you can maybe see up there on the slide, I have the actual CVEs that they were awarded for this research: 2021 26675 and 26676. Each of these vulnerabilities giving them a different level of control over this vehicle and what it's doing. So Conman is a commonly used, IoT handler for DNS and DHCP for any kind of network device. This is very common in the IoT world. A lot of, smaller, cheaper IoT devices that connect to Wi-Fi will use Conman for help with the DNS and DHCP. The version of Conman that the vehicle was using at the time was version 1.37. This was at the time the most up-to-date version with no known vulnerabilities in it. Actually, since Conman 1.34, it had been pretty stable and there wasn't a lot of security research done showing that there was anything especially wrong with it. But the researchers decided to fuzz it anyway, given that some of the handling of DNS seemed suspicious to them, is more or less how they phrase it in their paper, which I have linked at the end of the talk. But they targeted the DNS parsing section and found a couple of bugs. And of course, after expanding on these bugs with I believe it's a special emulator that they themselves made, They found the area that caused the program to crash and identified a function that calls a memcopy command without proper input validation, leading to the possibility of a Stack Overflow attack. Being the brilliant, post-exploitation kind of guys that they are, the researchers were then able to use a separate vulnerability, also listed here, to gain more information about the stack, right? Leaking information that allowed them to put together a payload to give them more access to this vehicle, right? Allowing them to bypass security measures such as data execution prevention and address space layout randomization. See the ASLR and the DEP. These are common techniques used to prevent hackers from getting execution on your stack. But thanks to this other vulnerability that was leaking information to the researchers, they were actually able to bypass those preventative measures that were in place. Interestingly enough, they actually initially came up with these vulnerabilities hoping to use them in a pwn to own contest that has featured vehicles in recent years, where if you actually hack, root the Tesla, you actually get to keep the Tesla. I believe it's held in Canada every year. Unfortunately, the convention, or rather the car hacking portion of this event, was canceled due to the coronavirus. And that's why it was revealed last year instead to a conference called AppSec West, I want to say. But once they got their foothold, sorry, I got kind of sidetracked, they utilized some other redacted techniques that they declined to include in the paper for sensitivity regions to escalate their privileges to root on the Tesla, giving them full control over the Tesla's infotainment system. From here, they could invoke any action possible through that infotainment system. Any of you who have ever been in a Tesla, the infotainment system is like this big, and it's got this, beautiful screen, and it's like you got your map, you got your music and everything. Especially in the Model X, it's really quite something. You can control your seat temperature, you can control the cabin temperature, the air conditioner, you can open and close doors. They could do anything possible from that IVI remotely without even being inside the vehicle, including like changing the music and stuff. So they called this the drone hack because everything needed to perform this hack could potentially be loaded onto a drone. And this is significant because, well, Teslas all around the world have this little quirk about them, right? They have to charge. So you could essentially, the idea was, you could take a drone with all of this software on it and kind of park it behind a supercharger and just kind of wait for unsuspecting Tesla owners to come park their car, go do some grocery shopping while it charges, and come back to find that, oh, someone opened my car and either stole all my stuff, or as Leonard did in the previous example, use some other vulnerabilities to give them the ability to drive the car away, right? There's any number of possibilities from there once you've gotten access to that infotainment system, letting you open the door. It's a very, flexible and fun attack platform, a drone. And they actually did show a proof of concept in their original release of this research that shows them doing exactly that, right? So very, very, very good work by Ralph and Benedict. I'm a huge fan, honestly. So taking a quick look back at the 3 case studies we went over, they have a couple things in common, right? All of them were essentially compromised through the use of close-range wireless technologies, either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. In the Lexus example, both of these technologies were actually used, one as the initial entry point and another to extend the range by which they could, proceed to poke at the vehicle. In all these cases, a lack of signature checks, or at least in the first 2 cases, a lack of signature checks allowed the attackers to reflash software on these devices without approval from the OEM, leading them to be able to remove filters on the CAN bus in the first example, or simply tell the BCM in the car to recognize my new key fob in the second example. Right? Both of these vulnerabilities that were used, all of the vulnerabilities, we went over 3 examples, they're very IoT-centric vulnerabilities, right? Bluetooth and Conman are very commonly used in IoT. Bluetooth, of course, being a very well-supported wireless technology for cable replacement. Your car supports Bluetooth, your headphones are Bluetooth, your smartwatch is Bluetooth, your Fitbit is Bluetooth. Very common in the IoT world, and so is Conman for the same reason. It's easy to use, it's lightweight, and it's very popular among embedded Linux devices. So that kind of adds to that same IoT centric, evolution of the vehicle, where the vehicle is now becoming part of the IoT, and maybe somebody in the marketing department took that a bit too literally, and now they're developing with IoT software in these production automotive industry grade vehicles now, right? And they were performed on modern vehicles, right? It's one thing I love talking about, is because remember what I said, Tesla is the car of the future. Yeah, but it's also got all the vulnerabilities of the future. So the fact that all of these issues may seem like, oh my God, how did they let that get in there? How did they implement this, this feature without having signature checks on all the firmware upgrades? Unfortunately, it does happen. And the automotive industry is still trying to catch up and get ahead of these problems before, self-driving cars become very widespread in the world, because that's really when this kind of lack of due diligence on the automaker's part may end up costing someone the ultimate price, right? And then, you have to give a shout out to Tesla and the ability to update their software over the air. If this had happened to a car without that capability, right, when you consider two of our case studies today had to do with Teslas, the fact that they have the ability to update their software and remotely patch any kind of vulnerabilities of this sort is really a blessing for them, and something we're likely to see more of in the future. But other automakers really have to kind of follow suit there. And the fact that these are all post-production vehicles ties into the previous point. These are all vehicles that were on the road. People were sitting in these vehicles, driving them to work every day, driving them on the highway, driving their kids home from school. And, God forbid, if this knowledge got into the wrong hands, somebody may have been able to, make use of it in a malicious manner. And it all ties back to preventing this from happening in the future. So how exactly would you prevent this from happening in the future? Of course, we talked a little bit about the new standards and legislation that are kind of being introduced into the automotive industry, the United Nations WP29, as well as the ISO 21434. These security recommendations and best practices need to eventually make their way into the development process for a vehicle. And it can't just be a one-step, okay, we did the cybersecurity check, now it's over. Security on such a complicated product such as a vehicle is much more involved than that. You have to make sure you're going through with all of your suppliers and making sure their products are secure and that they're doing checks. It's quite the task. Training for engineers and development managers, right? Maybe for the managers, they don't need to have knowledge of all the different attack patterns and how you might actually perform an attack on a car, but anyone in that position would still need to have an awareness of what cybersecurity means for a vehicle. What should they consider when making design choices for the vehicle or their components to ensure that they minimize the risk of a cybersecurity incident as much as possible. Of course, it's too immature to say that with enough effort, this device will never ever be hacked until the heat death of the universe. That's simply not true. That just doesn't exist. It's a fact of life that everything can be hacked given enough time. But it's our job to do our best to bring that possibility as close to zero as possible. And then comprehensive product vulnerability management. This is something that I think really needs to take off in the automotive industry. Every OEM needs to be ready to act on new vulnerability information and understand if and when this applies to any of their products. If we think back to the Lexus example, in the event that, the vulnerability that led to the initial RCE was, as a matter of fact, Blueborn had been, publicized for about 3 years prior to this research's release, right? Because it was Bluetooth vulnerability, right? Maybe no one made the connection that, hey, cars have Bluetooth in them. We should make sure that none of our products currently on the market have, susceptibility to this suite of high impact vulnerabilities that could lead to remote code execution. Maybe that context shift just didn't make it all the way over. Product vulnerability management involves knowing all of your products, knowing what goes into them, hardware and software, and triaging information, right? As vulnerability information gets released into different sources, different talks, et cetera, you need to have an intake of that, process it properly, and be able to apply it to your own products in the event it's relevant, make make accurate decisions on whether or not it affects any of your products. And then, of course, the action part is the most important. How do you solve it? Do you have to recall 2 million vehicles? Do you send out a software update? Do you just work into the next patch of regular updates based on severity? All of these things are parts of the automotive cybersecurity life cycle that will come around. I have confidence in it, but they're still kind of making their way in. And it's definitely going to be a while before they're really very widespread throughout the industry. So here is a list of the references that I used in this talk. Of course, once again, I want to give all the credit due in the world to the actual researchers that did such a great job on this research that they've presented and that I was able to share with you today. Hopefully you learned something. Car hacking is very fun and a very, how should I say, enjoyable field to be in. And maybe if it's not obvious, I really enjoy what I do, and I'd be happy to help any of you get into car hacking. If you are interested in any way at all, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn or send me an email at kamel.ghali@whitemotion.com. So thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be here at RootCon 15, and don't forget, hack the planet.